So Jacob was not paying attention. He literally asked me, hey, do you have everything covered today? And then it turns out that he's on the list, and I just overlooked it. So I was like, no, we have everything covered. So that was my bad. But we've been talking about this cycle of loving your neighbors, which is the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbors as yourself, to treat people the way that you would expect to be treated. And then the greatest commandment, it's moving people to loving God. We were just talking about that in the class this morning, that people come to know God by our works. Our works aren't what save us, but without works, without us talking about Christ, without us pointing people to God, it's likely not going to happen. And so we've got to move people to love God. We've got to get them in the Word. We've got to teach them the Word of God. We've got to introduce them to God and to Christ. And loving God is the greatest commandment. In all of the universe, it's the greatest commandment that exists. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And we've also got to shift each other and help each other to serve others. And today we're going to talk about some of the stumbling blocks that get in our way of serving others and how we get around that. But we've got to keep this cycle going. Our theme this year is becoming the hands and feet of Jesus. Serving people and going the places Jesus went, not hesitating, staying on mission. Jesus was on mission. He knew what his mission was. His ministry was literally 3 years. 3 years. And look at what Christ did while he was here on this earth. It's absolutely fantastic. Our theme verses are Matthew 25, 37 through 40. His disciples asked him, they said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. So this passage that really is the theme passage for this whole year, it worries me a little bit because it's the deciding factor when Jesus is given an example of what separates the sheep from the goats, from heaven and hell. When the judge is sitting on his throne and he's saying, okay, you guys made it and you guys didn't. That determining factor is whether you served your fellow man or not. That's the determining factor. And I think we don't take this seriously enough. And today's sermon is, it's going the extra mile. And it's in the context of retaliation. So it's not just like going the extra mile. We kind of throw that term around to mean just, going above and beyond. And we kind of strip it from its context. But the context today, where that passage comes from, is retaliation. And retaliation, I think a lot of us probably think in our own hearts that we don't retaliate. But we really do. Or at least we think about it. At least it's a temptation for a lot of us. Do any of you watch the Karma YouTube channels? Be honest. Do you watch the Karma? Terry, you're lying back there. Xander, my boy. I watch them. Especially the car retaliation, road rage retaliation. I love those videos because I hate road rage. And when people come in and they're cutting people off and flipping them off, and you see the little minivan get cut off by somebody because they're road raging, and the minivan's not going fast enough, or they get in front of a tractor trailer and jam on the brakes. I hate it. I hate road rage. And so when people do those things and they intentionally try to cut people off or run people off the road, I'm not going to lie, I like the karma videos. I like when that person winds up in a ditch or in the median. And I watch those videos because, it's kind of vicarious retaliation in my own mind. And I'm like, yeah, they got what they had coming. And Jesus is talking about those things, and when you become engrossed in retaliation, no matter how big or small it is, it makes it a lot harder to do this, right? This that we just read, it makes it harder to walk into the lives of people who are really struggling. I mean really struggling. and to not be judgmental. A lot of people will look at people who are really struggling and they'll say something like, they dug their own grave. With addicts especially, drug and alcohol addicts, so many people turn their backs on them because they say, well, you shouldn't have done the drugs in the first place. Life isn't that easy, is it? There are so many factors for what caused somebody to start turning to alcohol or to drugs or whatever it is. There are so many factors, complex factors. And when we're judgmental and we look down on people and we're waiting for some kind of retaliation, and I'll be honest, I know people who are waiting for people to die from drug overdoses because it's an I told you so. I've heard people say, it's so stupid that we give Narcan to our police officers, and pretty much everybody has Narcan on hand now, which when police officers show up or anybody shows up, they Narcan somebody who's overdosed, and it brings them back. I've talked about this before, very recently. I think it's a godsend. What an incredible thing that we have the resources to be able to give somebody a second chance. And when our mind is tuned to retaliation, and that's just how we think, whether we know it or not, whether we know that we think that way or not, when our mind is tuned to retaliation, it becomes an impossibility to serve people and to do it humbly. Some of you older people will remember George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman in 2012 took the life of somebody. George Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch person, volunteer in his town in Florida. And it sparked a nationwide retaliation and riots and all kinds of protests all over the place. And the media, unfortunately, turned that into a racist thing. Automatically, the media was doing that with pretty much every story out there. They would turn it into a racist story before there were ever any facts presented. Well, of course, that got people very upset and caused a lot of riots, and cities were burning and police officers were being threatened, and it sparked a really dark period, I think, in this nation. But what really happened with George Zimmerman, as the details kind of unfolded, is that he was kind of this paranoid guy who just thought that he was tired of criminals in his town, and he thought he was like the big dog. And so he was going to volunteer and kind of lead up this watchdog group within the community. And he was going to be armed, which was his legal right. He was going to be armed, and he wasn't putting up with any crap from anybody. And the first person who started breaking into cars because they had some petty thief stuff going on in the town. And so in his own mind, he was going to be the big dog coming out swinging. He was going to take care of matters. And it was a mindset of retaliation first. Instead of stopping to talk to somebody and figure out and kind of assess, at least at a bare minimum, assess your surroundings and see what's going on, his first response was, I'm going to retaliate, and I'm going to get them. We're so sick of these criminals, they're going to get what's coming to them. And it was that mentality that allowed him so easily and so quickly to draw his weapon and to pull the trigger and to take the life of a completely unarmed citizen. And he claimed self-defense, and he was attacked first, and they went back and they investigated and found that was not true. He was never attacked. He was never threatened. And he took the life of an innocent person because he had this mindset of retaliation. When you retaliate, especially to a degree that large, it completely alters your life course for the rest of your life. And I did a little bit of searching because you don't hear about George Zimmerman anymore, but it completely affected his entire life forever. He's socially isolated. He dropped off of social media. There was a time where he was kind of running his mouth, and he stood by his decision to pull the trigger that day. But now he's nowhere to be found. He can't find employment. He's a has-been, and probably always will be. And my fear is that if we have this mentality of retaliation, no matter how small, that we want to get back at somebody, we want them to have what's coming to them. When we have this mentality, it becomes harder and harder for us to humbly just reach into the lives of people who are struggling without judgment and to just step in and help. Which is exactly what this passage is about. I'm going to reread this passage from Matthew 5 that Cameron read just a little bit ago. Now, keep in mind, this is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is talking about all kinds of different things, but here specifically, he's talking about retaliation. He said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Somebody gouges your eye out, you gouge their eye out. They knock a tooth out, you knock their tooth out. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now I'm going to stop here for a second. I've talked about this here before, and I'll talk about it again. Jesus is not saying that we need to accept abuse. He's not talking about people who are oppressive. He's not talking about parents who beat their children. He's not talking about spouses who exert domestic violence. He's not talking about sitting there and taking that. He's not. He's talking about a mindset of shifting where if somebody comes up and they try to get you into a fight, they try to provoke you, you don't walk into it. You don't accept the challenge when somebody tries to draw you into a fight. Do we know anybody like that? Like people who they love drama? Cameron? Yep, you do love drama. Half your class, yeah. Like it's this thing where they want to provoke people. You ever see somebody walk up to somebody and push them and then pretend like they didn't do it? And that person gets upset and they're like, they're ready to go at it, and they're like, did you see what so and so did? And that person is like, what are you talking about? I didn't do anything. We were just talking about this the other day, weren't we, Eden? When we went to Granny's house, how I got in trouble for stuff that my older brothers did. They would provoke me and get me all wound up, and I would cry, and I was like making this big dramatic scene, throwing myself on the floor. Oh, I was a drama queen when I was a kid. Yeah, I know. Yep, there are videos out there. I was the one who got in trouble. And I fell for it over and over and over again. I kept falling for it. And I would get in trouble. And I knew that I would get in trouble. But I wanted to make the point that if somebody comes into my space and does something to me and pushes me or whatever, I want to scream and I want to cry and I want to be dramatic about it and I want to make a scene. And guess what? It didn't work. It escalated things. And it turned things around where I was the one getting in trouble. Jesus is saying in this passage, he's not telling people to accept abuse. He's saying if somebody comes and provokes you, be the one who walks away and lets it go. He's not talking about abuse or oppression. He's not talking about those things here. Verse 40, and if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If somebody's going to take you to court over a stupid tunic, give them your cloak as well and walk away. Take a small loss, give them something more, and you're going to make them feel a little bit bad about themselves. And if they don't feel bad about themselves, then it doesn't matter because you didn't escalate it and you didn't create this big dramatic show. Or fight. Or, like George Zimmerman, ultimately take somebody's life. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Today we're talking about going the extra mile. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. If somebody's begging something from you, give them whatever they're asking for. Now, to an extent, again, he's not talking about abusive people. We have people who are well known to the churches in Somerset who make a living from begging off of churches. They will not work. They refuse to work. They lie about what their needs are. We had one lady who came here before who shaved her head and pretended she was telling everybody she had cancer. And then she was walking around, and I had a lot of interactions with her, and they were not good. Like, none of them were good. And we had helped her quite a bit. And she was going around telling church members here that I refused to help her, that she was hungry and I wouldn't feed her, and that she was dying of cancer, which wasn't true. And I absolutely 100% verified it. And so I'm not talking about emptying your pockets without thinking about it. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about taking a humble approach when you legitimately see somebody in need. And your first response is not to retaliate against their lifestyle, but your first response is to help them get back up on their 2 feet again. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of going the extra mile. In Roman law, what he was referencing was, this is a nice AI-generated Roman soldier here who's forcing somebody to carry his stuff on his back. Roman law in Jesus' time allowed forced labor by Roman soldiers. It was called impressment. That was the term used for this principle. It was a very common practice in Jesus' day. Jesus is using language that was familiar to the people in his day. When he tells parables, he's telling stories that resonated with people. They got what he was talking about. They understood what he was referencing. It was a very common practice. It was a lawful order. Impressment was a lawful order that was backed by Roman government. If a Roman soldier asked you or told you, they didn't really ask, if they told you to carry whatever it was that you were supposed to carry, you had to do it by law. You remember when Jesus was carrying the cross? It wasn't by choice. It was impressment. It was Roman law. It didn't matter what the object was. It didn't matter how heavy it was, how big it was. It didn't matter whether it was a soldier's gear or whether it was their personal items. It didn't matter. If they told you you needed to carry something, you had to comply. So here's how it worked. There would be an encounter. A Roman soldier would stop anyone. It didn't matter who it was. It didn't matter how old, how scrawny, how big. It didn't matter. They would stop whoever they stopped. They would give the demand. They would demand that somebody carry the equipment for a mile. That was what was required by law. But oftentimes they would force you to go a little bit farther. And it was kind of one of those quiet things where they could get away with it, and there was no repercussion for the Roman soldier. But the law was, it was about a mile that you had to walk. And then there was the burden. It could include weapons, armor, supplies, or personal belongings. And then refusal was absolutely not an option. It could be met with severe punishment if you refused the impressment. So Jesus' point is, if somebody forces you lawfully to carry this equipment, if you're required to carry it for a mile, go an extra mile. Go farther. Don't retaliate. Don't talk about how unfair it is. Don't be willing to go to prison and risk your own life. Just go an extra mile. It's not going to hurt you. It's going to be inconvenient. It's not going to be pleasant, but it's not going to hurt you. So his point in this whole passage is don't retaliate. When we retaliate, it makes it so hard to be humble. It makes it so hard to not look down on people. It makes it so hard to be objective when we look at people. And if this is what separates us from heaven and hell, whether we serve people or not, I want to err on the side of helping people. I want to err on the side of humility. I want to err on the side of giving somebody a cup of water, or even if we think it's unfair and somebody asks us to do something that's absolutely ridiculous. You just walked in. Nobody ever asked you to do things that are just out of this world ridiculous, do they? Their requests never, they never disappoint, do they? Jesus says, just do them. Just do them. Is it a nuisance? Yep. Is it a pain in the butt? Yep. Is it annoying? Yep. Do these people get under your skin all the time? Yep. But if you begin to retaliate and refuse people, it escalates things. And Jesus says, don't be a people who retaliate. Be a people who humbly serve. When Jesus was told he was going to carry the cross, did he retaliate? Did he refuse? Did he mouth off? No, he did it. Don't refuse the person who would borrow from you. That's a tough one. I had to tell you, that's a tough one. But we better err on the side of helping people and being generous with our time and our money and our efforts and our talents. We better err on that side, because when it comes to separating the goats from the sheep, what are Jesus' requirements? Well, Jesus, when did we see you thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you hungry and give you a meal, invite you into our home? When did we see you cold and naked and clothe you? And he says, I tell you, any time that you did this to the least of my brothers, you did it to me. We've got to not retaliate. We've got to keep humility at the front and center in our lives, and it is tough. It's not easy. I know I say it, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's so easy. I help people all the time. But if we start taking a little bit of an inventory, I wonder if we help people as much as we think we do. Now, I wonder if we help people without judgment as much as we think we do. Be careful not to go down the road of retaliation. And if we're asked to go a mile, go the extra mile. Just do it. Move on, go on with your life, get back to what you were doing before. It's not going to kill you. But we better err on the side of humility. I'm going to end there. If anybody has prayer needs, or you've not yet taken the step to put Christ on a baptism, that invitation is always open. I'm going to lead the next two songs. DP and I are kind of sharing the load here today, so I'll lead the next two songs, and then I'm going to have our thoughts at communion, and then DP will close us up in three songs. So why don't we all stand, get the blood flowing, get the vocal cords moving, and let's sing these songs loud.